sau cánh nhà ngang thì khéo cho có vị đại quan triệu khải phước đến lâm trung mượn đèo sàng vẹn kiếp mà cùng bắn sẵn non hoành.
On May 19th, 1890, a baby was born in Kim Lining Nhan province in French Indochina. His name at birth was Nguyen Sinh Con. 50 years later, he became the world-famous communist leader of North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh.
Dưới sau cánh nhà ngang thì khéo cho có vị đại quan triệu khải phước đến lâm trung mượn đèo sàng vẹn kiếp mà cùng bắn sẵn non hoành.
In 1908 or 1909, Ho Chi Minh left home to travel the world, working on steamships as a sailor and as a cook. His travels took him to America, where he lived briefly in Brooklyn, in Harlem, and in Boston. He then went to London before ending up in Paris before World War I. In Paris, he worked as a cook and as a photo retoucher. There, he met other Vietnamese expatriates who shared in his commitment to the struggle to overcome French colonial rule in their far-off homeland. At the end of World War I, upon reading of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, with point number 5 being, quote, adjustment of colonial claims with reference to the wishes of the governed population, unquote, Ho Chi Minh in 1919 rented a bowler hat and a black suit and went to Versailles to present a proposal he had written calling for justice and equality between his native Vietnamese and their French colonizers. While he was denied entry into the meetings taking place, news of his activism eventually got back to his fellow Vietnamese fighting for their freedom in Indochina. On July 1st, 1922, Ho Chi Minh published an article entitled Racial Hatred. This is an excerpt. For having spoken of the class struggle and of equality among men, and on the charge of having preached racial hatred, our comrade Luzon has been sentenced. Let us see how the love between peoples has been understood and applied in Indochina of late. We will not speak for the time being of the poisoning and degradation of the masses by alcohol and opium, of which the colonial government is guilty. Our comrades in the parliamentary group will have to deal with this matter one day. Everybody knows the deeds of Daring Do, of the assassin, administrator, Darles. However, he is far from having the monopoly of savagery against the natives. A certain Porcignon furiously rushed upon an Annamese who was so curious and bold as to look at this European's house for a few seconds. He beat him and finally shot him down with a bullet in the head. A railway official beat a Tonkinese village mayor with a cane. M. Beck broke his car driver's skull with a blow from his fist. M. Bress, building contractor, kicked an Annamese to death after binding his arms and letting him be bitten by his dog. M. Defis, receiver, killed his Annamese servant with a powerful kick in the kidneys. M. Henri, a mechanic at Haiphong, heard a noise in the street. The door of his house opened. An Annamese woman came in, pursued by a man. Henry, thinking that it was a native chasing after a Kongai, snatched up his hunting rifle and shot him. The man fell stone dead. It was a European. Questioned, Henry replied, I thought it was a native. A Frenchman lodged his horse in a stable in which there was a mare belonging to a native. The horse pranced, throwing the Frenchman into a furious rage. He beat the native, who began to bleed from the mouth and ears, after which he bound his hands and hung him from them under his staircase. Has justice punished these individuals, these civilizers? Some have been acquitted, and others were not troubled by the law at all. That's that. Ho Chi Minh joined the French Socialist Party in 1920, but quickly discovered that they were not concerned with the injustices of French colonial rule, nor with the struggle of the native populations. Thus he turned to the Communist Party in Paris, of which he became a founding member. In contrast to the Socialists, the Communists already had a platform devoted to agitating for the freedom of colonized peoples throughout the world. Eventually, Ho Chi Minh was sent to Russia to participate at the highest levels in forming policy and plans to aid colonized people in Southeast Asia. It would be 20 years before Ho Chi Minh would return to Vietnam. In the interim, he was in Russia, China, and Europe. He was jailed at least twice in China and sentenced to death in absentia by the French government in Indochina for being a revolutionary. But as he was in jail in Hong Kong at the time, the British refused to extradite him and helped him escape to his freedom. In 1941, during World War II, he was finally able to return to Vietnam. Once home, he formed the Viet Minh independence movement. Early in World War II, the Japanese had taken control of Indochina as a prime source for raw materials for their war effort. This, along with the fact that the French colonial government had sided with the Vichy government in France, put the Japanese and them against the Allies, the US, England, and Free France forces. After Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh saved a downed United States Air Force pilot and returned him safely to an OSS office, having to get through 300 miles of enemy territory, the United States, England, and the Free French realized that they had an ally in Ho Chi Minh. For the remainder of the war, the Allies supplied weapons to the Viet Minh and got information from them on Japanese and French Vichy troop movements in Indochina. Ho Chi Minh sent many letters to President Harry Truman, petitioning him to support independence for the Vietnamese people. There is no evidence that Truman ever read the letters, nor that he ever responded. The Viet Minh had kicked the Japanese out of Vietnam, and so, in the interregnum, post-World War II, the Viet Minh were able to take control of large swaths of North Vietnam. In 1952, Ho Chi Minh wrote an article entitled "The Imperialist Aggressors Can Never Enslave the Heroic Vietnamese People." Now, he wrote it April 4th, 1952, under the pen name Dinh. In the article, Ho Chi Minh wrote, "In order to show their American masters that U.S. aid is used in a worthwhile manner at present as well as in the future, in November, de Lattre de Sagny attacked the chief town of Hoa Binh province. The results of this quote-unquote shooting offensive, which the reactionary press in France and in the world commented on uproariously, was that the Vietnam People's Army held the overwhelming majority of enemy troops tightly between two prongs and annihilated them. But this did not prevent de Lattre de Sagny and his henchmen from hullabalooing that they had carried the day. At the very beginning of the war, the Americans supplied France with money and armaments. To take an example, 85% of weapons, war materials, and even canned food captured by our troops were labeled Made in USA. This aid had been stepped up all the more rapidly since June of 1950, when the USA began interfering in Korea. American aid to the French invaders consisted in airplanes, boats, trucks, military outfits, napalm, bombs, etc. From 1946 to 1954, Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh guerrillas fought against the French in an attempt to remove the colonizers. At the Battle of Dien Bien Phu on May 7, 1954, the Viet Minh finally won that war, and the French were forced to leave Vietnam in large part. That year, at the Geneva Accords in Switzerland, where Ho Chi Minh hoped to gain independence for all of Vietnam, he was instead forced to accept the division of his country into a North and a South, with the promise of free elections being held in 2 years. This resulted in a communist North Vietnam run by Ho Chi Minh and a puppet government in South Vietnam run by leaders put in power through support of French and United States political divisions. 1954 to 1963, the French and the South Vietnamese governments fought in the South and in the North against Ho Chi Minh's attempts to unify the whole country and to remove all French colonial control once and for all. The United States continued to help, though, and by 1963, the war became entirely fought by U.S. forces. Thus, on August 2, 1964, when the Gulf of Tonkin incident took place, escalation of the U.S. involvement in the region began in earnest. Over the next 9 years, the war, now known as the Vietnam War, was fought by U.S. forces against Ho Chi Minh's North Vietnam. In a June 6, 1964 interview with a French journalist, possibly shown on French television, but found on YouTube with English translations, subtitles, Ho Chi Minh makes comments concerning U.S. and French involvement in Vietnam affairs and the war as well.
Est-ce que vous pensez, Monsieur le Président, qu'il y a une solution militaire à la guerre du Sud-Vietnam?
Non.
Mr. President, do you think there's an army solution to finish the war in South Vietnam?
Vous savez que le peuple Vietnam, c'est un. Et le pays du Vietnam, c'est un.
Because as you know, Vietnam nation is one. Vietnam country is one.
Faire une guerre d'agression, comme qui dit, c'est une guerre non
The U.S.
déclarée.
launched an undeclared war.
Comme vous savez aussi, vous avez pu lire dans la presse, n'est-ce pas, mondiale, que plus
And also, as you know, international media
plus la guerre prolonge,
analyze
plus les Américains et leurs
the
valets
longer the war, the more the U.S. and their servants
et s'enliser.
will get bogged
Et
down.
plus
And their recent
ils
failures, as
supportent
you know,
des échecs, comme vous savez récemment. Par conséquent,
this war cannot prolong
la guerre
definitively.
ne peut pas durer éternellement. Et
We are very happy
je
that
suis
high-ranked
très
French
heureux
politicians also
que les
understand
politiciens
this
haut placés
reality.
français ont reconnu cela.
Vous pensez que le général de Gaulle
Do you think
pourrait
that
en quelque
de
sorte,
Gaulle,
à un certain moment,
General de Gaulle,
arbitrer le
could be
conflit?
at one point an arbiter for this
Arbitrer,
war?
qu'est-ce que vous
What do you mean
comprenez
by
par
an
le mot
arbiter?
arbitrer? Nous
This
sommes
is not a football game.
Phận bèo đón lưng đợt xa, chứ có biết đâu là số trời. Đừng đánh cái sao qua, khiến cho họ kẹo được đi tình rằng đám kia có kiếp sống mình. Chỉ cô định kiếp để lôi, tiếng người nghe thấy đây.
How many men who listen to me tonight have served their nation in other wars? How very many are not here to listen? The war in Vietnam is not like these other wars. Yet, finally, war is always the same. It is young men dying in the fullness of their promise. It is trying to kill a man that you do not even know well enough to hate. Therefore, to know war is to know that there is still madness in this world. For we have children to teach, and we have sick to be cured, and we have men to be freed. There are poor to be lifted up, and there are cities to be built, and there's a world to be helped. Yet, we do what we must. I am hopeful, and I will try with best I can with everything I've got to end this battle and to return our sons to their desires. Yet, as long as others will challenge America's security, and test the dearness of our beliefs with fire and steel, then we must stand or see the promise of 2 centuries crumble.
By 1965, Ho Chi Minh was 75 years old and had been fighting for the freedom and independence of his people his entire life. On September 2nd, 1969, Ho Chi Minh died. Though he did not live to see it, on March 23, 1973, the last U.S. military unit left Vietnam, and on April 30, 1975, the North Vietnamese accepted the surrender of the South Vietnamese government. This marked the unification of an independent Vietnam, which was the dream of Ho Chi Minh for his whole life. Not long after, Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the man who fought so hard and so long for his people's right to self-rule.
Gây sắc trai tại tri ngộ bèo nọ trôi